Everybody, I think, is here, so we're going to get started. I wish I could tell you that that was a planned 25 minutes to demonstrate the need for a workforce that can address transformational technology, but I can't. But what I've been looking at the agenda, and we're going to we'll move forward, and I think we can pick up some time in key places. I will do that. Thank you, everyone, for being on the call. And again, our apologies for the technical difficulties. I do want to thank everybody who's in the room here. We have Ginny, Alex, and Clark, and myself. I know we have Tony out in Portland, and in a moment we'll be able to hear from everybody in the 5 regional centers. Our goal today, as I said, we'll pick up some time, is we want to go over the year 1 of the NTCPI. We're going to talk a little bit up front about some of the common methodologies, the relationship to broader FHWA goals. Then we'll have each of the 5 centers briefly talk about the outcomes of the year 1 findings, the priority occupations and pathways for each of the 5 disciplines. We'll then move on to year 2 objectives, including the status of the demonstration program, and then have some time at the end to talk about beyond the initiative. And to hear from everybody at FHWA. So if you want to move on, I do want to just let everybody know who is on the phone, and this is good. Will be another tech test. So Tony, are you there? And do you want to say hello to everybody? I don't know if Tony's on mute.
Well, it's interesting. I had muted my computer and thought that I was speaking to you over the phone, and apparently you didn't hear me, and now I unmuted the computer, so I'm not exactly sure which of these 2 devices is picking up my voice at this point.
Well, the good news is we're hearing you, though. That's the important thing.
At this point, we're going to take what we can get.
Can I have...
Welcome, and thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Can I hear from the Southeast?
We're here.
Okay, that's Stephanie Ivy. The Midwest?
Good afternoon, it's Teresa, I'm here.
Thank you, Teresa. The Northeast?
Hello, this is Glenn.
Hi, Glenn. The West?
This is Steve Albert from WTI in the Western Center.
Thanks, Steve. And the folks in Long Beach?
Hi, everybody. Tyler Reeb here with Scott Jakovich and team. Welcome.
Thank you. Okay, well, so we want to now move on to a little bit of the NNTW story and remind you all how we got to this point. What you have on the left-hand side is an overview of why the FHWA established, from our perspective, the 5 regional centers, building upon some of the momentum that came out of the Workforce Summit, and to put in place an infrastructure to help you all on the ground move programs forward and connect people. The 5 centers, I think we've worked really well together, focusing on our individual efforts, but finding a way to connect across the centers where it's appropriate, including on this NTCPI effort. Okay, can move forward. So, and I think this is, largely as a reminder, perhaps for Tony, who hasn't been in all of the discussions that we've been having. We're a consortium of the 5 regional workforce centers. We work in collaboration with the team here in FHWA really closely throughout the year on our own efforts, but also on efforts tied to things like TRB. We've taken an approach that uses the research capacity of the universities to drive the programs that we've developed, and to establish more effective and cohesive transportation career pathways, which is embedded and institutionalized through the NTCPI effort. Okay, that initiative itself is something that we see as being important because it aligns directly with the strategic objectives of the DOT performance plan. And we've sort of tried to quote that plan off on the right, that the objective of the program is to establish, document, and validate the knowledge, skills, and abilities, the KSAs, as well as the career pathways for the top occupations within transportation, planning, environment, engineering, safety, and operations over the next 15 years. And you'll be hearing from each of those 5 disciplines today. The initiative also connects the career pathway and workforce development with economic development and economic competitiveness at the regional as well as at the national level. We explicitly try to identify and advance the CTE pathways that support transportation jobs, and in the process addressing STEM and transportation-related academics for K through 16 students, with the pathway focusing in particular on the 2-year to 4-year levels, and improving pathways across all occupations. Right? The objectives for the project, the high-level objectives over the 2-year period, were to form discipline working groups to provide guidance to each of our efforts at the discipline and regional level, and that's been completed. We've built a broader stakeholder network that builds in part upon the work that we've done as workforce centers. We've identified priority occupations for the short and near term out to 15 years, determining in-demand skill sets, and you're going to hear about those shortly from everybody. Assessing the state of education, training, and experiential learning programs in the process, and identifying skills and training gaps, framed in part by a decision to look at the impact of transformational technologies and what it means on future needs for the workforce. That's all been completed. And then designing career pathways for priority occupations in post-secondary, and that's also been completed. So 1 through 5 were year 1 objectives that you're going to be hearing about. Number 6, documenting implementation plans and demonstrating the pathway will be the focus of our year 2 objectives. Next slide, please. The NTCPI, the Career Pathway Initiative, is a way to actually touch the students and the workforce and the industry on the ground. And I think so it solidifies the efforts that we've been working on all along as a network of centers. But the vision of NTCPI is moving beyond the career pathways on paper to something that we can ultimately translate into practice, is one thing that drives the vision for the NTCPI. We all started, even though we have very different disciplines and very different regional focus areas, we all were driven by a common set of methodologies that we used to define the research portion of the NTCPI, and to ask key questions that we want to be outcomes of this effort. So if you look at the next slide, next 2 slides, these are some questions I think will be helpful to think about as you hear the presentations from each of the centers. And then at the end of those, I'm going to try to come back and revisit these and answer them and see what we've learned by synthesizing the findings of the individual efforts. The first thing we want to ask is, what's unique about these 5 disciplines? And what's common, right? Because we want to understand what's common to transportation, but what's unique to each of those 5 disciplines. We want to ask the question, who or what is a transportation professional and how did they get there? If someone defines themselves as a transportation professional as opposed to a transportation planner or an environmental transportation specialist, what does that mean to them and to us who have to design programs? What are the value and what are the constraints of current labor management information systems? Where did we identify the gaps in looking at labor market data? What barriers exist within the academic institutional framework to make the career pathways possible? If you can put it on paper, that's great, but if you have institutional barriers, particularly on that 2+2 side, community college to 4 years, how do you overcome those, particularly maybe as part of a demo project? Can we promote greater 2-year to 4-year academic connections, which is related to that question number 4? Who is the audience for these nationalized career pathways? Is it industry? Is it the guidance counselor? Is it the student themselves? Figuring out who the market for this effort is, I think, is critical, and we've come to understand the language of career pathways may open us up to new audiences, but it may close us off to others. Can transformative technologies forecast workplace change? That's the $10,000 question that we want to answer, because that's one of the things that we'll find that the LMI data doesn't tell us. And how can the planning demo that we're doing inform our implementation plans and contribute to the next steps for the other centers? Next slide. So a lot of this is, as I said, is built upon the work that we've done, and it's a matter of partnerships. And so for all of the work that we've done, we've engaged and convened our academic and industry stakeholders to steer and advance the initiative outcomes. Next. And you'll see, this is a slide that you've seen before, but with now an increased number of partners that have been brought to the table through the discipline working groups, through the demonstration plans, through people who have implemented our surveys. It's a growing list, and I think this does speak to the fact that the NNTW has that network and infrastructure in place to do some of this work. So they're not here, but we want to thank all of our partners who have been critical to this effort. Okay. Now what I'd like to do is we want to move on and hear from each of the centers and talk a little bit about the priority occupations and pathways that came out of the work that we've done. So I am now going to turn it over to Stephanie Ivey, who is the director of the Southeast Transportation Workforce Center. Stephanie, just as a heads up, I have 1:35 East Coast time, or 1:36, so we'll try to take it up to about 1:50, if that's okay.
Sounds good, and I will go through this as quickly as I can.
Thank you.
All right, so we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Yeah. So with the approach from the Southeast, one of the things that we were really starting from was the fact that with transportation operations, what we saw was that we really needed to address what we're calling tunnel vision. And that's that depending on the stakeholder that we were talking to, how they defined what transportation operations meant and what was contained within that was completely different. And they really weren't recognizing the fact that there were overlapping areas within which operations professionals work within the transportation industry as a whole. And so we started from the standpoint of looking at this and saying, okay, what we're really seeing is from the a more detailed perspective, we've got professionals that are either looking at this from a traffic, a transit, or a freight lens. And so this was how we went about defining our approach to transportation operations. And we did this so that we could approach this more holistically and think about this from a systemic approach in operations. Also because of the similar competencies and really the opportunity to learn from approaches that were used in other segments of the industry. And then also the need to really address workforce development challenges from a collaborative approach and help workers to really see this lateral mobility option. So some of the key challenges that we are faced with are that the occupations themselves are very poorly defined. There's a rapid pace of technological change within the industry as a whole. And I think arguably operations is probably impacted by this more than really any other area of the industry. And so that is a real issue for looking at how our career pathways lay out. And then this unclear pathway for progression is also a real challenge because with occupations being poorly defined, it's certainly not clear then either how you get to that next step. So one of the things that became really important for us from the outset was really to develop occupational examples and role models. So I'll talk a little bit more about the transportation spotlights in a little bit, but that was really why we started thinking about it from that standpoint. Next slide, please. So from the standpoint of the state of practice, what we really found was that the opportunities in operations are varied. There's multiple entry points, and it's really across the spectrum from occupations requiring a technical or 2-year degree or maybe just a certification, all the way to occupations requiring 4+ years of higher education. And we see this whether we're looking at it from the standpoint of traffic, transit, or freight. So that's a commonality among those. And what we see in terms of the technical versus professional occupations are that we have similarities, but we also have some issues that are really unique to each. And so when we look at the similarities, the thing that really pops out from that is, number one, the fact that we are dealing with ever-changing technologies and the need to work with data, and really to take data and turn that into information. So that's kind of the crux of all of the occupations within this area. And then the other thing is really the importance of soft skills, and particularly communication. And this again links back to the fact that they're wrestling with all of these technologies and the need to extract important information from them. And so that requires that everybody across the board, from the frontline worker to the decision maker, is able to communicate and say the same thing. So that's really a key element of similarity across these disciplines. And then in terms of what's different, the technical paths that we see really have well-defined training and advancement. The challenge, though, is more related to perceptions and prestige, and helping people to understand what the real opportunities are within these occupations and recognize that these are not technical occupations of the past, that they require advanced training, a lot of very strong STEM skill sets. And there's a real need to raise the awareness of these occupations and the prestige of them so that we have more people interested in pursuing these career paths. From the professional tracks that we deal with, the real issue with these is that they have such limited visibility. So there are so many different ways that you might get into operations from a 4-year plus degree path, but there aren't that many connections actually in school. And so what we find is that people in these roles tend to actually stumble into them. So they aren't choosing them on purpose from the outset. So that's really a significant issue. Next slide, please. So with our approach to this work, we took a very similar approach to, I think, really all of the other centers in addressing this. And so what we did was we started from Bureau of Labor Statistics data to identify a large set of potential occupations from which to focus. And then from there, we vetted this through our discipline working group, which was comprised of industry experts in traffic, transit, and freight operations from across the country. And from that, we refined that set of occupations. Then we went out to a larger external stakeholder group through a survey, and then came back and using a lot of real-time job data, we were able to refine this list even more, and then circled back around with the discipline working group one final time to come up with this final set. And what you'll see here is that we have, through this iterative process, developed a list of occupations where you see a lot of overlap across those sub-disciplines within traffic, transit, and freight. So we see the need for project managers and commercial drivers and diesel mechanics, computer and information systems, really across the board. So as we moved forward from there, we began to look at how to identify what the career pathways look like from this. So next slide, please. So the traffic operations career pathways, we developed a set of these for each of our priority occupations. And what you're looking at right here is the traffic operations, traffic signal ITS technicians pathway. And with this particular example, it showcases some of the challenges that we really saw in a variety of settings. So one of the issues here is that, first of all, whether we call this a traffic signal technician or an ITS technician, and whether or not these are the same thing is still something that's really very up to debate, depending on who you're talking with. And so recognizing that we have to start thinking about this in terms of maybe occupational clusters and how to start really looking at what the competencies are and what those requirements are is the approach that we're moving forward with. Next slide. So in summary, the key challenge that we really see is defining the discipline and making sure it's visible, not only to students as they're starting to think about those career pathways, but then also really within the industry itself and helping everyone to recognize those lateral opportunities as well, so that we don't lose people who are very skilled in this area and they just might not have found their fit in one particular mode or area of the operations segment. And so we want to make sure that lateral opportunity is provided. And then the other key thing that really was very prevalent from the outset in all of our discussions was the fact that the pathway and workforce efforts really cannot begin at the post-secondary level, and particularly for operations. K-12 initiatives are really essential. And industry and academic partnerships are really critical, because our biggest gap here is approaching transportation operations as a discipline as a whole. And so there's a need for a cohesive, comprehensive, and collaborative approach.
Thanks, Stephanie. We built in some time after each of the presentation for questions. In the interest of sort of moving forward, I'd probably like to limit the amount of time, unless there's anything that's really burning for Stephanie's section. We're okay in this room. Tony, how about you? Anything in particular you want to ask about operations before we move on to the environment discipline with Glenn?
Yeah, if you could go back to the slide that shows the transit, freight, and operations. That's a pretty broad range. I mean, when you add commercial drivers in with ITS technicians, you're covering an incredibly broad spectrum. And the examples at the end were more on the traffic side.
Yes.
So it seems to me that you're trying to cover an incredible range of skill sets, and if all of those skill sets are going to try and define operations as a discipline, that's really, really broad. I mean, in federal highways, we describe the discipline operations as more the left-hand column of traffic and not anywhere over in the transit.
Correct. And so what you don't see in this, well, first of all, also I just noticed this table is not actually the one that should be in here. So this is not really the table that showcases our final set. And what you will see when you see that one is that they actually align across these different disciplines. I'm not sure how this one ended up in there, but anyway, it actually aligns across the disciplines. So you'll see like the top 4 in each one are actually the same. And so that's what we're talking about in terms of that mobility. And what we ended up doing was developing a competency model for traffic, for transit, and for freight. And so that, I think, is really where your comments are, or your questions are addressed. So we do have a single traffic operations competency model, and then we have a set of career pathways just for traffic operations. But what we're trying to showcase through this is really that if you go into traffic operations and it's not the right fit for you, don't leave operations as a whole. There may be something else within transportation, whether it's in transit or freight, that environment fits you better. But it's that same set of skills that you've got that are transferable. Does that answer your question?
Well, that crosswalk would be intriguing to see. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and Tony, this is Tom. I think the idea is that there's multiple pathways for all of these. We wanted to give you an example of the presentation of one that comes out of each of the disciplines, but your point is well taken, that there are a lot of these are broadly defined and demonstrate a need for multiple pathways. I'd like to turn over now to Glenn McCrae at the University of Vermont to talk about the environment discipline.
Great, thanks, Tom. We can go on to the next slide here. So as we looked at the environment as a discipline, one of the first things that came up for us was that by its nature as a field, environment is inherently interdisciplinary, which presented a series of challenges and I think some opportunities right at the beginning. And we looked in particular to start at FHWA's kind of listing of environmental topics that were covered in the environmental section. And, it's staggering in terms of the actual range, whether one looks at competencies or if we get down into specific occupations, what is actually covered within that. So we decided to take a couple of focusing efforts to move forward, and the first was in order to try to parse out environment discipline occupations that would directly relate to transportation and separate from other disciplines and other fields. We settled on starting with a higher level analysis, looking at projections in various reports and future-oriented documentation, and two examples of that was the Beyond Traffic 2045 report and the Smart City Challenge applications, and those 78 applications were actually really rich in terms of mining information. And we wanted to see if we could build off of these findings and projections and gain a sense of work and related occupations that could be married to what we could see as investment commitments being made in transportation programs and infrastructure around the country, where there was an explicit outcome or aim of mitigating environmental impacts and increasing environmental quality across these range of topics that FHWA has a specific interest in. And the areas of sustained and substantial growth that we identified clustered into 4 areas: smart cities, build out, ITS, various sustainability initiatives, and the field of shared use mobility. And our definition of priority occupations became related to the emerging fields and investments that we were seeing under these clusters, transforming transportation, requiring new competencies and knowledge in workers, and a new infrastructure for training and education behind them, aligned again back to addressing specific environmental goals. One of the things that was notable is that a lot of these occupations and a lot of these fields do not have transportation in the title. Again, somewhat of a challenge. Next. So we wanted to look at who is currently working in the discipline, and even just from the projects that I manage, here at the university, I work with wildlife biologists. I work with regulatory analysts and air quality technicians and health professionals in different environmental transportation projects. So there is a current state of practice, which is, again, interdisciplinary, bringing people from multiple disciplines to address transportation environmental problems. But one of the questions is, are those transportation occupations or not? So there is definitely a steady state need of workers and occupations and competencies coming out of these more standard environmental science education tracks to work within the field. But what we were trying to identify is where's the growth? Where's the emerging practice from technician level to leadership level that is going to really identify what that next stage of development in environmental transportation related work and the corresponding occupations. So there's, from our perspective and our investigation, there's notable growth possibility from technician level occupations to leadership in what we can loosely classify as the new mobility fields that we just previously discussed. It's in these fields we're starting to see the growth in diverse education programs and growth in fields essential to building out this next generation of transportation alternatives that we're all on the government, federal to local, as well as in the private sector, investing quite a bit of money in. We're finding that in the case of the Smart City applicant partnerships, even those who were not selected in the top tier have started implementation. And in those partnership projects, quite a few involved academic program partners. And so we started investigating what type of programs were already actually in place to build out those workforce pathways. And in addition, what we're finding in some of those programs that we did do a deeper dive into, most of them have a very high level of experiential and participatory learning already built into work being done with employers. Next. So we looked at 4 occupational groupings. And again, I think, this, like with Stephanie, very broad and very, very deep at the same time. So it's somewhat complex in that. But we think each of these clusters is built around a growing set of investments, particularly at the municipal level, that are happening, and a growing set of growth in particular occupations cited here. And what we're trying to do is navigate across these interdisciplinary waters and look at how we kind of keep these occupational categories apart from the other 4 disciplines. And we think our overall approach really does that, really allows us to segment the work that we've been doing from the overlap that is also apparent with some of the other discipline working groups. One of the takeaways from this is that environmental work in transportation often parallels or really closely tracks with other desired outcomes in the work to achieve them. Safety, economic resilience, equity, planning. Environment often is not a specific goal that one can segment out and just cite individually. The outcome, the work, the people that do the work crosses multiple disciplines, and it makes the development of a clear and distinct environmental discipline occupation track somewhat problematic. So from a developmental perspective, interdisciplinarity, however, can also be a positive force, as we think inherently it attracts, it has a sense of greater attraction for younger workers to a field like transportation that might not have been considered before, and building resilience in the skills and competencies of workers who are going to be called on to change their orientation over the course of their working life several times. We want to look at how we build those skill sets in an interdisciplinary framework. Next. So building out career pathways was something, again, we stayed with this more clustered approach. We found a high level of continuity across these clusters in both what we call the foundational skills as well as many of the technical skills. Although we also found that there were a number of different entry points. So this particular area in sustainability shows a level of entry at the 4-year level, but other clusters have multiple entry points at the technical education certificate side as well. In building these out, we're looking to identify clear indicators of future demand, multiple entry points, create more clarity in aligning foundational skills with emerging technical skills and knowledge requirements, so they're really building on one another. We can actually see them track across a career path. And we've been identifying educational and training programs already existing or emerging that are clearly being aligned with employer needs in these fields. Provides us with a better template and story to engage our stakeholder networks in now better identifying how these clusters are both growing and how the needs are changing, because in these fields and disciplines that we have been working on, they're emergent. They're rapidly changing just in the year that we've been doing this work. Next. So there were 5 kind of takeaways from this initial investigation. First, that transportation career pathways as a whole, and particularly environmental pathways, are increasingly interdisciplinary. That those fields and the environmental fields really can't be easily separated from those other tracks. That the new mobility systems and technologies that are rapidly emerging are setting the stage of rapid advancements in more environmentally sound and equitable transportation systems. As we see the deployment in those areas, we should be able to align that with environmental quality indicators. We do know, in terms of our initial investigation with partners and looking at post-secondary programming and workforce training, that they're struggling to keep up with the changes that are happening. And finally, that transportation, while we all acknowledge it as a significant factor and its impact on the environment, it's still actually underrepresented as an acknowledged sector in sustainability and environmental programming, particularly in secondary education programs. Thanks.
Thank you, Glenn. I'll ask if there's any sort of burning questions. We'll have an opportunity at the end to sort of talk about these all in common. But once again, Tony, if there's anything in particular, we'd love to hear your questions or comments.
No, I don't have any comment. I mean, no, I'm good on this one. Thank you.
Okay, great. With that, then, I'd like to turn it over to Steve Alpert from Montana State to talk about the safety discipline.
Thanks, Tom. I think, in listening to today, one of the things I'm recognizing is just how broad and how deep each one of our subject areas is. And I think to make sure that we get or at least for the Safety Center, the thing that we really wanted to do was to make sure that we were inclusive, and we were fortunate to successfully engage national professionals, including public and private practitioners, training providers like ARPTA and ITE. Jeff Bignati was on our discipline working group, and professional organizations who are planning safety certifications. I think the consensus of our safety discipline working group members was that career pathways for safety must be cross-disciplinary, cross-occupation, so they have an understanding on how to use safe systems approach, and interconnected with design, construction, maintenance, operations of the transportation system. In the first year, we had a lot of questions and a lot of issues to address. And some of the themes and goals and issues and questions that emerged from that first year were things like, how do we promote safety competencies without creating safety silos? And how do we promote safety at the organizational level to create safety career pathways? We recognize that the need to create career ladders, otherwise, if there is no demand, there will be no supply. And it was interesting in looking through the US DOT strategic plan, the word safety is targeted 250 times. So maybe we will have a lot of demand and a lot of supply given that type of frequency. For successful career pathways, there really is a need to have a greater recognition of safety competencies, especially at the human resource decision-making perspective. I think most state DOTs have highway safety engineers, but it may be only one position within the organization, and what we're really needing is safety competencies to need to be integrated into the job roles and responsibility at an organizational level. Otherwise, what I think can potentially happen is you have a single point of failure. Another issue is the second issue that was raised by the discipline working group was, how do we change one discipline and one occupation paradigm that no longer reflects the workplace and future industry needs? What we're seeing is a greater increasing of multidisciplinary needs, but at the same time, we're having difficulty hiring people and processes and linking it even to higher educations, because universities are glacially move, and so do human resources departments. Next question that was brought up number 3 is how do we add content and skill sets to the existing degree and training programs? We found that industry safety certification and industry involvement in education provides for a great enhanced safety opportunities, and I'll speak more to this a little bit later. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk about the critical safety occupations. The Center on the Safety Disciplinary Design Groups identified 9 critical safety occupations for career pathways. They focused on infrastructure, construction and maintenance, engineering, design, operations, and analysis. And these critical safety occupations promote a systems approach to safety and core competencies. It should be noted that, you know, when you say safety, it is such a wide-ranging field. One of the things we had to do was to quickly try to narrow it. So things that were related to occupations relating to EMS or first responders, we really didn't consider. We also wanted to make sure that we use a filtering process that whatever we were doing relating to safety also mapped back to 2- and 4-year degree programs at a higher education level. Next slide, state of the practice. State of the practice is interesting to say, but one of the things we had problems with, and I think both Glenn probably had some of the same issues, is that if I say safety, it's very hard to find in on-the-job issues that usually safety is very buried, and you have to go dig for safety, which may be the same kind of thing Glenn has with planning as well. So many of the construction KSAs always end up referring more to OSHA requirements and tended to address job site safety rather than system-wide safety performance. Emerging technologies were also a major issue in terms of attracting supply and also putting increased demand on things to learn regarding technologies, which may be very difficult to get at a job training level rather than at a university. And again, one of the things we also find in a university, while safety is a very good thing to be promoting at the institutional level, there is an accreditation process that would have to fit through, and that can sometimes be very problematic. It's not just so easy to do multidisciplinary courses when you have to keep aligned with a program degree program. Next, pathways. Our road safety career pathways really wanted to focus on multidisciplinary programs of study, and this is what the design working group visions was. The safety professionals must choose, we see that as specialized human factors, civil engineering, planning, statistics, etc. And while many of the other groups that you have seen today in terms of their pathway looks like they go straight in ours, I think the safety one really is more like a zigzag or chutes and ladders trying to connect the people who want to develop a career with some of the specializations that exist out there. Almost have to go back and forth to get those types of skills. Next slide. One of the things that we have found, I think, in the last year is there are some good examples of what's going on out there. One being Brigham Young University and Utah DOT have formed a partnership where 25 BYU students, graduate and undergraduate, created safety models and conducted data analysis that the Utah DOT could use for looking at safety countermeasures. A second model that looked good out there to provide for improved pathways is engaged scholarship, like they've implemented through the Education Partnership for Innovation in Communities framework, which is going on in Oregon. It matched local governments and agencies projects with existing multidisciplinary courses offered at the university. This model provided students with applied learning and safety capacity. Another one is for industrial credentials which highlight the market safety and KSA attainment as individuals progress along the career pathways. There's also the ARPTA model that's looking at safety certificate for transportation project professionals that's mapped back to existing degree programs. And lastly, ITE's efforts relating to their safety certification blueprint. So while there are challenges out there, there's also hope, and I'll end there. Tom? Anyone there?
I hear you.
We're here. Okay, I think we'll move on then to Teresa Adams at Wisconsin and engineering.
Okay, thanks. I guess, did you want to see if there were any questions?
Well, we're okay in this room.
Oh,
not sure.
okay.
And Tony, sounds like I didn't hear anything from him, so I think we should proceed.
Sounds good. Okay, I just want to warn you all that I got braces put in my on my teeth this morning, and so if I sound like I have a bunch of junk in my mouth, I really do. Okay, next slide. All right, so engineering is a very, very wide discipline, like the rest of them, maybe bigger, covers a whole college of engineering and in my university. Within the transportation agency, engineering is also very wide. In this particular project, we're focusing on what we're calling the highway maintenance engineering, and really what we're looking at that is sort of marrying the skills in the highway construction with education for managing and maintaining facilities. So now, part of the background on how we've focused a bit that way is we were also asked to look at future trends. And so if we look at infrastructure funding trends, many states are going maintenance first. A lot of agencies from design and build to more operate and maintain. We've also done a lot of interviews. We're finding that a lot of engineering-ish positions are going to non-engineers. There's a big demand for that. We, in the maintenance and operations, there's also huge competition for people in the construction labor. We're also noticing then the trend within agencies to do some outsourcing of the engineering. The big gap here is really that engineering schools focus on new design, not on sort of how do we retrofit, repair, and refurbish. So next slide. All right, so who are we talking about on these occupations? And so we did a bit of a bottom-up approach more, kind of looking at really who does the maintenance and then where does the engineer level or the engineering knowledge come in on that pathway, and then what's their role within the agency. We also did a lot of surveys to understand how whoever is the state maintenance engineer, the chief maintenance engineer, how did you get there? We did interviews with agencies, different levels of agencies. We reviewed job postings to understand criteria and credentials. We looked at literature and burning glass and some of the other information out there. So this is sort of the list of the high priority the priority occupations, and you can see that many of them have very high projected percent changes, demand changes, but not only that, but they have really high number of projected demand of employees. So we're talking about lots of workers. You can look then at the median wage. We're also looking at jobs that are have a very wide range of salaries, and I'll get a little bit more into that to give you a vision. Next slide. Okay, so here's this vision. If you look at, or the previous slide, I gave you a list of job titles that are really just SOC codes, and something like general manager, just a plain old civil engineer, some of those occupations really don't mean much to me. They probably don't, I don't expect them to mean much to others. And so what we did was spend time really through job announcements and so on to kind of map exactly what are those occupations within a typical transportation organization that would map into those SOC codes, so we can kind of get a better idea of what we're talking about. And and those are mapped on this circle diagram. The diagram really starts with very little or no competencies. There's the paving labor, just general maintenance workers. So there's really no education experience. But what this does show you is that if people are in those jobs, they already are used to working outside. They already are understand something about the infrastructure and equipment. And so this is the pool of people that really do work in the maintenance engineering. Then if you look at the next level of the circle, what we label as on-the-job training, those are really all the workers that you might, this maintenance operations supervisor, the fleet maintenance manager, the operations assistant public works director, superintendents. And so a lot of these jobs are the ones that I'm mentioning where there's a lot of promotion that are for engineering-ish jobs that are not, that are going to people who don't have engineering training just simply because there's not enough candidates in the workforce pool. But that doesn't mean that all of these people don't have like at least a 2-year degree. And actually probably about, it's increasing every year, but many of these jobs are jobs that don't require a 2-year degree, but they prefer it, or at least the job announcement says they want it, but then they may not fill it with a 2-year degree. The point here is that there are so many people already have a 2-year degree, and our vision is then, how can we tap into these people who already know something about the organization and get them into career pathways that we see and need for the engineering. And some of those are regenerative ecosystem stuff where recognizing how much of an impact, increasing human and environmental impact of transportation, much beyond just air quality. The equipment and automation, we understand huge benefits of equipment automation in order to address workforce shortages. You've seen the crash vehicles already. Colorado has one. Iowa or Idaho has a RFP out for these automated crash vehicles. And so we're reducing the number of workers, but who wants those jobs anyway? And then there's the typical infrastructure renewal and resilience and repair. And that's kind of our traditional civil engineering, construction engineering, field engineers. So the idea here is that the strategies are pathways to these engineering techs. For incumbents, there's a lot of opportunity to get involved with a lot that's going on in the apprenticeships, and we're seeing a lot of that as well. And then building our own kind of building engineers that know something about transportation. Currently, there's a heavy reliance on education resources that come from APWA, NHI, TC3. So the next slide, and I'll show you more of what we mean by that. So here's kind of an example or a cartoon from non-credentialed, credentialed associate's degrees and bachelor's to give you an idea of sort of what's going on right now. And a lot of it right now is simply because of the high demand for workers and the lack of training for them. So some state DOTs are actually starting at the bottom. They are state DOTs. Some actually are opening apprenticeship programs in this area. Some are doing it with following on then using credentialed apprenticeships. Some are just kind of more internal apprenticeships. The state of Colorado DOT is working with Front Range Community College to put together an associate's degree of highway maintenance engineering, and then that would be credentialed. That's all online. Counties work a lot with public works and various municipal technical schools and so on. And then the very end of, on the far left there, starting at the bottom, the community college. So there's a lot of people that go to a community college, get, you know, a certificate or credentials in some equipment or different things, and then get a job at DOT. And then we've seen a number of people, actually in a survey of about 30 people who work at within the maintenance. They might be the maintenance superintendent or the public works director or the chief maintenance supervisor or something. We've actually looked at the about 30 of them that do have degrees. You'd be surprised how many of them went from a 2-year to a 4-year. And so it really does happen, and it happens within transportation organizations. So next slide, please.
Yeah, and Teresa, Tom, just to check, we got a couple minutes. I know you got 3 more slides.
All right, I'm going to really finish the point here on this one. So what our strategy then is to look at some of the existing apprenticeship programs and see how we can work with those to build apprenticeship programs that will address some of these engineering areas. Next slide. All right, and so here's the final, or the map of this pathway chart that you've seen some of the others present to you. And on this one, the only thing I'm going to point out on this is that we've worked with this level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, and those are the levels that are defined in the AASHTO TC3 as the levels of the worker and knowledge that goes for the maintenance worker up to level 4, and some of those actually are sort of assistant maintenance superintendents and so on. And those are people that many do have the associate's degree, and those are the people that we're looking at to pull into the engineers. Okay, next slide. And my last slide, thank you. So, summary: engineering positions are filled by non-engineers because there aren't enough people. Outsourcing, this won't make it go away because competition is then with the vendors. We see the context here is that the automated and connected vehicle technology will just simply change what we're doing in our transportation infrastructure. Shrinking workforce will make some of the automation necessary. We also see a changing context in really just what we have to worry about in maintenance because there's so much more awareness in human and environmental health impacts. Right now, the status of education is heavily relied on OJT, some industry certificates, but there is a lot that's been put out there by knowledgeable people. It's in certificate form and not necessarily on the pathways to engineering techs, which then can get us onto the pathways for engineers. And our recommendation is apprenticeships.
Thanks, Teresa. And I know we're going to have, we've caught up a little bit of time, but we're going to have opportunities to go over each of the disciplines when we do our final wrap up. But I do want to give, again, Tony an opportunity to ask a question here where everybody else in this room is okay.
I think we'll have the conversation toward the end, but again, this one is as broad as the operations. And I mean,
yeah.
To capture a civil engineer and a construction laborer within the same discipline is as broad and wide and deep as anything I've seen. So I just think focusing is going to be a focal point going forward.
Yeah. Agreed. And I think as we shift to the synthesis points, Tony, I think that's reflected in some of the recommendations, but your observation, I think, is correct. I'm going to ask my team to keep me on track with the 10 minutes. I've been watching the clock here, but for the next 10 minutes, I want to have somebody else do that. So everyone, I want to talk now a little bit about the planning discipline, transportation planning, which we focused on in the Southwest. I'm a product of an unintentional career pathway, in part because I'm trained as an urban planner with a transportation concentration. Of all of the disciplines, I think in some ways this is the most clearly defined because it's the most siloed. That creates a hierarchical career pathway, which in some ways makes it easier for some students to pursue at some levels, but at others it creates access problems to the career ladder and the pathway. We started with an occupational analysis trying to figure out how do we characterize the role of planner, transportation planner in particular, and so we looked to the American Planning Association Transportation Planning Division for the definition as a starting point. This is how the industry, it designs itself, right? So planners responsible for designing, evaluating, and planning the implementation of state, city, or community transportation mediums, which is fine. It is often identified as a distinct concentration within a broader urban and regional planning context, although you do have transportation planning as degree and certificate options moving through the educational hierarchy. And as you've heard before, there's significant disciplinary overlap with the environment, with some of the land use planning skill sets, and with engineering as well. The workforce challenge is that because it is so hierarchical and siloed that we see significant gaps in the development of the skill sets, particularly those that are being generated by advanced technologies. So next slide, please. Our approach was to look at to define our critical occupations and pathways, was to do an assessment of sort of the state of practice for employment as well as the state of practice for education and training. So we looked at our own jobs needs and priorities report, which was developed for the NNTW scope of work. That was foundational for us. We used traditional labor statistics, ONET, data, and then supplemented that with burning glass technology to try to capture the demand for transportation employment in a more dynamic setting. Recognizing that transportation planning job positions might be most readily advertised through industry groups, we did a year's worth of analysis of job postings with the American Planning Association to get a sense of what positions and competencies were being demanded. And we did a similar study for all of the job postings for the Southern California Association of Governments over a year, part as a methodological test to see what would happen if we looked at the nation's largest MPO and the demand for jobs and competencies over the course of that year. We used significant input from our discipline working group with practitioner interviews, and we implemented a nationwide survey through the American Planning Association Transportation Planning Division and our discipline working group members from the transportation field, and I'll touch upon that briefly. What we found is that competencies better define the occupations, even for this very hierarchical career pathway. There's a significant gap for new emerging positions that's not captured by the traditional LMI, labor market information, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics data. There is strong alignment of knowledge, skills, and abilities at the national and local level, and our survey responses indicate that, which I'll talk about in a minute. Planners are mobile across specialization, so movement across the transportation, urban planning, environmental sector, but that's driven by the development of the competencies, not by the occupations themselves. We also did an assessment of education and training programs of study. And again, this is where the more narrowly defined subset of the occupation helped us. We had a unique set of schools with transportation planning and urban planning degrees that are organized through the Associated Collegiate Schools of Planning. So that became a data set that we used. We also looked more extensively at our own backyard and looked at all of the planning schools and that had accredited programs for what programs they had. What we found in all of this was that there is virtually no 2 to 4 year feeder programs at the educational level. So while at the very top, at the master's level program, transportation planning is an intentional career pathway. You get there in a very accidental way. And I think that reflects some of the other programs, but that's specifically the case here. Next slide. Next slide. Can we move forward? There we go. Thanks. This is sort of the results of our planning competencies assessment based upon our discipline working group input, the labor market data, as well as the survey. And we had 155 responses to date. And you'll see there is some consistency in terms of the competencies that are asked for by potential employers. You'll see that there's a couple of clusters where there's more correspondence, things like regulatory compliance, geospatial and GIS technology, and then obviously the principles of planning and development cut across all of our data sources. Next slide. We used all of this input and, guided by our discipline working group, came up with our set of priority occupations. What you'll notice is that some of the traditional transportation planning titles like urban and regional planner, transportation engineer, and transportation planner itself are not surprising. What we did see is that there are some occupations with a low baseline of current employees, like cartographers and photogrammetrists, but which we project have a significant potential for increase over the coming years. Cartographers and photogrammetrists we're starting to see in job occupations tied to drone technology and the need to assess and translate data that comes in through drones into new cartography and a new measurement. So that was interesting. The other thing that I think speaks to the fact that competencies are increasingly critical and that the job occupations themselves may be a little too rigid and structured is that we're increasingly seeing high-level categories like urban and regional planner as an occupation, but with specializations that are competency-based like data and GIS management and modeling and forecasting appearing in our job listings. Next slide. If you look at our priority occupations by survey, I just wanted to connect this to the transformational technology, pull this out. So these are all responses from the survey that indicate that these occupations are critical. And what was interesting to us is this, as you sort of see the sliding scale down at the end, is we're curious over the next year to find out whether these last three, surveying and mapping technician, the cartographers, and city and regional planning aid, are in fact being impacted by technology. We're seeing over time staff getting reduced because fewer people have more jobs, and so there's an impact on high-level job positions where people have to do more, have more competencies to do the job. And as I mentioned, the cartographer photogrammetrists appearing on the list, where at one point we thought maybe cartography would be going away. Next slide. This is our transportation career planning pathway. As you'll see, this one again reflects that hierarchical nature. Particularly at the master's level where people have to opt into a transportation or urban planning degree program, that's highly intentional. How you get there differs greatly. There are increasingly degree programs at the undergraduate level in urban planning which feed into those master's programs. The real gap, though, is at the 2-year to 4-year and beyond program pathway, where you may have urban studies at 2-year institutions, but what you really have are a set of competencies that could feed into planning programs, but that are not explicit or intentional. And we're missing opportunities to capture those competencies the way that the system is currently structured. You'll also notice that compared to the other disciplines, we have fewer certification options. And even within the planning discipline itself, there's a great tension between the need to have an American Institute of Certified Planner certification if you already have a master's. If you look at the planning blogs, there's a lot of discussion about shouldn't we be if we need the skill sets that the certification offers, shouldn't our master's programs be offering them? Next slide. So what we found is that we have a highly vertical and hierarchical career path in transportation planning. There's a strong network of narrowly focused academic and accredited programs of study at major universities nationwide. And again, we looked explicitly at those that were not transportation engineering, but transportation planning. And this is an important point with this discipline. Employment is generally contingent upon the degree attainment. Those occupations that we identified were directly linked to a master's in urban planning or a master's in transportation planning, sometimes a Bachelor of Arts or Bachelor of Science. There's a general lack of effective pre-employment experiential learning opportunities based upon our curriculum scan, apart from internships. We see tremendous opportunities for growth in areas like apprenticeships or to more engage with the urban labs around the universities. And general lack of four-year feeder programs from community colleges and technical schools because of the lack of explicit connections based upon the discipline and occupation. And that would sort of lead in, if there are no other questions, to sort of what we found that's cross-cutting and what we want to do with the demonstration project in year 2 in the Southwest. I want to pause there and see, though, if there are any questions.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to take away from you, Clark, but one of the things is I like to get your feedback and thought on the kind of conversation we should have or are we having for the not 4-year degree program, because there are a lot of technical skill sets, 2-year degrees for apprenticeships as relates to our highway construction industry. And oftentimes when I look at that, what kind of conversation is occurring? Because that's the field where most of us believe you need a 4-year degree.
Right.
But at the same time, industry is looking for skilled workers that doesn't necessarily require a 4-year degree. How is that impacting our workforce in the future? Because I see a great impact in that area.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great lead-in to some of the things I want to talk about in the demonstration program. Some of this is driven in part by a public versus private sector approach. The hierarchical nature is even more so in the public planning agencies at the state level and in state DOTs, for example. I think there's more flexibility and there's more concern on the private sector side to be able to sort of start with a competency-based approach, because they're identifying skill sets. They care less about the job title or classification, although there is a relationship, because there is a fair amount of movement between the public and private in transportation planning. And so those transportation planning occupations are the common currency and common denominator that allow people to move in between the two. If we can increase, I think, the focus on some of the competencies and skills, we may see more responsive industry.
Okay, thank you.
Tony, any questions from you before I move on to a couple of synthesizing thoughts?
No, by all means.
Thank you. So my job here, I mean, there's been tremendous work, as you've seen, at each of the 5 centers. Some of it's overlapping, so there are common findings, as we mentioned. Some of them are unique to the discipline. But I think there are a couple of key takeaways, and this reflects back to the set of questions I asked at the beginning. So I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about these now, what we've learned. So what's common across disciplines? We all felt the pain of the breadth of these occupations, right? In a good way, because they're rich units of analysis. But clearly what we heard from the research and from our discipline working group is to follow the competencies, not the titles, okay, as a starting point. The other thing that I think the research takes us is to a discussion of what is a transportation professional that is cross-disciplinary, because increasingly, as you've heard, we're seeing people who address environmental and planning and engineering all at the same time. And so for many of us, we found a way to tell that it was helpful to tell a story of somebody who's followed a career pathway in sort of a real people, real story approach. And Stephanie has sort of done some work on this and with transportation spotlights. And I wanted to pass it off to you, Stephanie, to maybe mention briefly about what was driving your decision making to develop these.
So one of the things that we saw really across the board in transportation, not even just focusing on operations, but really magnified when we looked at operations, was that people have absolutely no understanding of what a transportation career is. And it really started when we were talking with people around the Transportation STEM Academy that we started here in Memphis, which is a high school. And when we were talking with parents, they were almost combative when we were first proposing this model. And when we got down to the crux of it, it was because they didn't understand what a transportation career was. They looked at these only as dead-end jobs. They had no connection to STEM at all. So there was no concept there was anything STEM at all within a transportation occupation. And so when we started to put stories in the faces of the people in these different disciplines, that started connecting those dots and really making it come to life for not only parents, but for students, for teachers. And then that sort of is what translated into our desire to go ahead and start with the transportation spotlights and really start to highlight people and tell those stories and help to make that real.
Yeah, and I think that's a critical finding that we want to build in, and it's certainly part of our demonstration approach. Thanks, Stephanie. Another key finding is that the current data that we're working with, that sort of everyone recognizes, is good but probably not enough, because it fails to properly characterize emerging fields and occupations. It's historical in nature, which has its strengths, but it also doesn't capture the dynamic nature of job posting. So Burning Glass is a tool which we sort of all use to look at Monster.com and Indeed postings, helps fill in some of that puzzle. It also has its problems and its biases, but in combination, historical data with more dynamic tools gives us a better picture of the workforce demands from the employer side. Number 4 is absolutely critical across the board. There are systemic academic institutional barriers, right, that include the inertia within institutions, the hurdles that have to be adopted to create new curricula over time, to develop new degree programs, the accreditation process lagging behind real-world needs that doesn't properly account for the benefits of work-based learning or experiential learning because it crowds out traditional coursework. That's something that we've seen. And then the constrainment of academic silos. Stephanie's point that she just made about STEM designation is also critical. There are a number of programs that offer scholarships to students in STEM degrees, that offer advanced placement to students in STEM degrees. International students get an additional year of allowable training in the U.S. under the OPT program, 2 years if it's a STEM designated program. So those disciplines that don't, or those degree programs that don't have a STEM designation, make us less competitive compared to other parallel programs and occupations. Next slide. The need to connect 2-year to 4-year programs explicitly. You heard that in a couple of places. I'll mention how it's critical in transportation planning in a minute. And I address this up front. Who is our target audience for these career pathways? Career pathway models are really, really helpful to guidance counselors, to teachers, to people in the world of CTE. Do they speak the same to the industry that's hiring, or is there another tool or methodology or language that we should be looking at? I think that's something we want to address over the second year. And then, of course, evaluating transformational technology so that we can not just study historical data, but forecast occupational impacts. And there we have, new tools in scenario development. We have artificial intelligence that are themselves developing competencies that we actually should build into our career pathway models. Okay, so bringing it all together for year 2 objectives. Next slide. What are we going to be doing over the next year? We're going to be looking at the lessons learned from the Planning Career Pathway Demonstration Project, which I'll mention very briefly. We're going to be using those demonstration projects to help, we hope, inform the development of the implementation plans for the other 4 centers. And in the process, developing stakeholder agreements to implement those plans and then submit a final project report and presentation. So really this next year coming up is moving beyond the study and the research phase to the implementation phase. Okay, next slide, please. So our planning demonstration in Southern California is actually looking at making more explicit the 2-year to 4-year connection in transportation planning by creating a pathway that's competency-based. And the competency that we're focusing on is geospatial and geographic information systems analysis, which is one of the competencies that came out of our year 1 effort. What we are doing is looking at flipping a traditional model where you teach GIS skills to transportation students in a degree program, and we're embedding transportation within a GIS class at the community college level and in the process, we hope, raising awareness and demonstrating the potential for career pathways at the 2-year level. So we just right now it's underway. We have a Saturday class that's being offered at one of our community college partners, LA Trade Technical College, which is in downtown Los Angeles. It's we took a GIS class and we've made it a hybrid GIS planning class. We've contributed the curriculum on transportation planning to an existing GIS program. Launched LA Trade Tech, and we've been able to leverage dollars from the California Strong Workforce Funds, which are monies dedicated to the community college programs to focus on the development of middle skill competencies, so those between the 2-year and 4-year institutions, helping to develop career pathways and curriculum that contributes to those career pathways. So our needs are aligned with a statewide program, and we wanted to take advantage of that. And it's the actual workforce funds from the community college that are paying for the instructor for this class. The really exciting thing is we're also being able to test the career pathway model back at the 2+2+2 level, right? So the high school to community college. We have 14 students in the class. 12 of them are from 4 LA Unified School District high schools who are dual enrolled. So they're getting credit for this class as a high school, for their high school program, as well as community college credit. That is transferable to a University of California system or a Cal State University system like our own. So that's some of the institutional issues we've tried to address. This allows us to sort of track and assess student career paths, and ideally I would love to be able to build upon this and go after an NSF study that looks longitudinally at what the students do in subsequent years. Next slide. What the approach that we're taking is because LA Trade Tech is in the heart of downtown Los Angeles, adjacent to the downtown entertainment corridor, the LA Staples Center, adjacent to a lot of rail uses and highways, is use the campus as an urban laboratory for this class. Okay, so it's a complex metropolitan location serviced by multiple transportation modalities, which allows us to look at transportation in a real-world setting using GIS as the foundation. Next slide. We're also trying to build upon the fact that this class is a transportation planning experience. What you see on the right-hand side is a walk audit tool that was developed by our students. So we're actually trying to, from our students at the master's level at Long Beach. So we're actually sort of using the career pathway model with our own GIS master students to get them exposure to transportation issues. And some of the exercises in the class are going to ask the students to engage with the site around them at the college from one of 4 different transportation perspectives. Some of them will be using the tools as pedestrians or bicyclists. Some of them will be using it as a truck driver, some as a driver of a car, and some as a user of public transit. To look at the site and how effective it is from that perspective. Is there safe lighting? Is there safe access? Are trucks backing up and blocking the path of bicycles and pedestrians? So we're teaching the concept of transportation planning using a GIS tool developed by GIS students who are on the career pathway as well. Next slide. Okay. We're using GIS story map technology to also tell the story of planning as part of the process, and we're engaging industry to enhance the curriculum through the use of this technology, right? So the students are looking at the transport network, and our industry partners have helped design the message that's coming through in this class. Last slide, or next slide. The other thing that we're doing is we're also looking at career pathways as curricular tools. I taught the class last Saturday, and I did an overview of transportation planning, but one of the things that we talked about was what are how do you look at the urban environment, right? So here's the story map looking at different ways to get to LA Trade Tech. And next slide. And also, how do you translate this into career pathways with earning potentials? So we talked explicitly and used career pathways as part of the curriculum to sort of get them interested and excited about the class. Right? And so this is and the students on the last 2 weekends of May are going to be presenting the findings from their walk audit as a GIS product, but with a focus on the skill sets that they've developed as transportation planners, right? Very basically, how do you look at a site differently if you're developing those transportation planning skills? Over the course of the time in the class, on the last day, they're going to be connected via conference meeting with the master's level class in GIS, which is also happening on Saturday, to sort of be able to connect with students who are on the next stage of the career pathway as well. Okay, and then next. So what we hope is that these inform the implementation plans that are being developed. We hope that in the process, what we learn out of this experience is that we can articulate pathway strategies and designs to post-secondary partners. One of the things we learned in our intake process is none of the students had an awareness of transportation planning before, and we want to see how that changes. And we hope that that process helps the other centers with their plans. We want to provide a methodology for refinement to address local industry needs, using and creating a template in the process to do so. We want to target workforce administration so they see, sort of the those people who are on the ground working in WIBs and in other places, understand the needs of students and returning professionals both. And then, as I've mentioned before, looking very closely at the institutional barriers that prevent these pathways from being developed, and then focusing specifically on the 2 to 4 year program. So that's sort of where we see the organization of our findings from the demo being put forth to support the implementation plans being developed. Next. We've got, certainly, as you've seen, demonstrated stakeholder commitments from a number of our industry partners. We want to continue engaging post-secondary stakeholders to secure commitments for pathway implementation and deployment over the next year, so that by the end of the grant, there's a process in place to be able to take it to the next level if resources allow. Establishing programs to leverage the strengths, resources, and those community partnerships. Right? I'll move on because I wanted some time for discussion. So next slide, please. By the end of year 2, you all will get a final report and presentation that sort of hones these research methodologies into something that, if we're making a recommendation for a competency-based approach, we want to make sure that you have tools in place to do so. Final occupational priorities that come out of our continuing assessment. Final career pathways with competency models and implementation plans connected. That will be critical. A final analysis of the planning demonstration will have another year's worth of data and post completion, or something shy of a year, but post completion assessment to report on. I think we want to talk about the barriers and recommendations for deployment into post-secondary institutions, since that seems to be cross-cutting, and provide a status of our implementation partnerships, where they are for you all.
Hey, Tom, if I may just interject for a quick question.
Yeah,
One
sure.
of the things I want to ask is that as we go through this process and the final report and recommendations are being prepared, are we going to have the ability to see some replication across the country to other universities on some of the successes, and not just the tools will be active. In other words, they can be replicated or adopted by other universities. Or what is the outcome?
Yeah, I think there's two paths. I mean, the NTCPI grant has a narrower set of outcomes, and that is looking at implementation across these disciplines. I think what the NNTW gives us is an opportunity to translate the findings into the toolkits that are available via a national website or our individual websites, using the broader set of stakeholders that we've been engaging with to say, hey, here's what we found. Are you looking for ways to replicate this? I can see the demo model being replicated at planning schools and with community college partners across the country. So I think what I just presented was sort of the narrower set of what we want to do under NTCPI. But I think the infrastructure is in place through NNTW to be able to get to a broader set of impacts.
Okay, thank you.
And then the last slide, beyond the initiative, what has always sort of driven our need, and this is actually, I think, connects directly to your comment, Jenny, is that, having a place to go that's a dynamic website for these sources. There is a lot of, there's a distributed network, and that's fine. People go to the connections that they know, people who have good information. For us, if we can bridge some of those across disciplines in a way that at least allows people to find each other, we'll be doing our job. And that should be, I think, one thing we look at down the road. And then building upon these educator, student, employer connections. The other thing that I think is important is sort of looking at regional pathway deployment, as you said, right? What can we do starting at the regional level to take advantage of what you've put in place in the 5 regions, particularly since there's some alignment with regional economic development goals in other agencies within the federal government. You can align those, right? And then, how do we find ways to promote those pathways? How do we find ways to work with faculty at both the 2-year and 4-year level, and also high school if possible, and the infrastructure stakeholders? I want to close here because I want to open it, but I think I just as a closing point say that we've learned a lot over this first year. I think we found in some ways, though, that we've increased the number of questions that we have that are somewhat vexing. I think we see a way out of it by focusing on the competencies, and that's what's going to make year 2 exciting. So I'm going to close it there, and thank you all for your attention. And we're anxious to hear what your thoughts are.
This is Clark. I'd like to really defer to Tony. I've been working with the centers for this program and before and probably beyond. We'll see. But Tony, I know this is probably, I don't know probably, I know for sure, the most in-depth opportunity you've had to hear about the Pathway program, other than some general overview from me or Jenny from time to time. So I wanted to make sure that, if you had the opportunity, and just if you have any questions or comments, I'll certainly defer to you and make sure the directors have an opportunity to address some of any interest you might have. And I've got some things to say, but I'd rather defer to you first.
Well, thank you, Clark. I appreciate that. First of all, thank you for the presentation. I think the 2 things that struck me the most about this presentation is kind of the breadth of what is being considered. All the way from civil engineers to construction laborers, from ITS specialists to commercial driver's license operators. It spans an incredibly broad stretch of occupations, all of which are important to the transportation industry, I fully and readily acknowledge. But just looking at the breadth of this kind of takes my breath away. There's an awful lot. And if you go back 2 slides, Tom, on what you were presenting, there's a part of this where it says barriers and recommendations for deployment into post-secondary institutions. And that speaks to a certain element and set of competencies and skills where that kind of information is acquired. but it doesn't speak to CDLs, it doesn't speak to construction laborers, it doesn't speak to any of the more blue-collar functions that have been identified in all of this. So as we go forward with this, kind of teasing apart exactly where we think we can make a difference and where we want to focus our energies, I think is something that's going to be really important. And then the other part that struck me is the interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary or cross-disciplinary, there's a whole bunch of different terms that are used for it, nature of a lot of these skill sets. And, you know, I guess I'm talking to an academic group, so a lot of you probably are in occupations that are directly related to your undergrad or graduate studies. But it's been my experience in working in federal highways and across a number of other areas and agencies, that the likelihood that you're working in a field that is directly connected to your academic background, that is probably a 50-50 proposition. So looking at what you have identified with critical thinking skills, problem-solving skills, public outreach, people skills, teamwork skills, these are all the skills that seem to translate across all of these different functions more readily than most. So with that, I will stop because I want to hear what Clark, who is closer to this, has to say and what you guys have.
Thanks, Tony. Ginny?
Well, one of the things that keep coming to mind as we look at next steps, we have a lot of information, and how can we prioritize and refine this as we go forward to the top priorities that have been recognized from the educational standpoint as well as the industry of the norm that's going there, and what are some things that we need to consider, whether it's leveraging resources within the educational community or within the professional communities. But when there's a common theme that I keep hearing as I'm out in the field is that we're in this area where we have this new generation coming in, and we're looking at, in some of our instances, as two-year institutions for some of the skill sets that's needed for our transportation industry. Now, how are we going to not only expose them to transportation as a career, but get their family to understand the value and the possibilities of their kids going to a two-year university versus a four-year university to meet the immediate need to this process? And I guess I'd like to hear your thoughts on, do you see this as a concern, or what some of the things that you're hearing out there? Because this is a conversation that we live in a society, whereas children are expected to get bachelor's, master's, and PhDs. But that's not necessarily a necessary need for highway construction. A two-year degree may do it just well and later on evolving. And how can we include that as we market what we're trying to sell to get our workers to meet that timeline that we would like to see them out there?
I have some thoughts, but I've been talking a lot, so I want to open it up to my colleagues from the other centers to answer that first.
Can I jump in on that one? So
Sure.
This is Teresa. So some of that is exactly where we see tremendous opportunities are at the two-year schools, particularly in many of the occupations that we're looking at that are entryways into the engineering. And which are those jobs that are sort of the supervisory level jobs that do require some technical training. And we see that then as where a number of incumbent workers have actually sort of risen up the ranks and gone from those types of jobs where they already know the agency, they already know a lot of the work that goes on, and then they themselves get more education and then at a two-year school and then advance even to a four-year program. So in many cases, what we've also seen has been that agencies are sort of growing their own on some of these jobs, particularly when you look at sort of the maintenance or construction and then the supervisory jobs that go on about the infrastructure.
And anyone else on the team want to comment?
This is Stephanie. I can chime in on this too. So I'll talk about it a little bit before the range that Teresa was commenting on. So when we look at it from a K-12 perspective, it's a huge challenge to get not necessarily the students to think about these occupations that maybe only require a 2-year degree as an option. It's a huge challenge to get their parents and their teachers to think of this as a valid career path. And so, you know, that's one of the things that we have discussed in our working groups repeatedly. And so we actually have next week during our Transportation Summit, we've got a keynote session and then a workshop that's completely devoted to looking at how we change the conversation around transportation CTE, because there's so many jobs that are necessary there, and the numbers are actually the largest in that group of occupations. And so, you know, that's really a big issue that we have to grapple with.
Yeah, and I would add, I think part of it is that some of those programs are in place. Like for us, GIS technician exists already. That's a 2-year degree. That may be enough to serve a particular need within the industry. What I think the gap is connecting that one isolated occupation with the broader transportation community, so that the student understands that there is potential for a pathway later on if they want to, and also so they see themselves as a broader network of professionals that they could tap into. The other thing about Stephanie's point about raising awareness goes back to my question about who are the career pathways for, and who the market is, and who's making decisions about the students entering into programs. One of the things that we found in our community in Southern California is that you can't have that discussion without talking about faith-based communities and churches and places where weekend programs exist at the grade school and high school level, and making sure that they're not excluded from programs and outreach, because that's where parents are getting information about school opportunities and pathways. So I think Stephanie's point is well taken.
Tom, let me offer this very brief. Anybody else have a comment?
No, I was just going to say thanks, Stephanie. I appreciate that. That's great.
This very hopefully brief comment. When I listen to presentations, and they're all very good, and certainly concur with everything Tony has said there. Here's the bottom line, I think, in my perspective on K-12. And some of you touched on it, but the one that struck me, the comment, and so it was a very appropriate and stunning comment, as Stephanie's comments generally are. She said, parents have absolutely no idea of what a career in transportation is. And then others kind of, and we all know that. But here's my real point. And your presentations and your work has been all about leveraging resources and opportunities with the discipline groups and reaching out to others and some of the education system and so on. So two comments. One, and it's not, well, maybe three quick ones. One, we knew going in that this was not as complete a pathway process as we would like, we in Federal Highway, and everybody would agree. Maybe middle school, high school, right into the post-secondary that you all are focused on. That was the direction. That was what we were asked to do, and that's what we did. We would have preferred to do the younger grades. But so my point is, as you go forward, and I know it's not part of your program here under the cooperative agreement, but you're maybe, or at maybe some point, maybe the next iteration, we need to consider what we can take from your post-secondary work and apply it to middle school, high school. And to that point, if I think, I'm going to speak for myself now, about leveraging resource, we have a Garrett Morgan program we operate out of this center. We're about ready to go out with another request for proposals, and we've got to frame that and all of that. And I just think we need to kind of take what you all have learned in your other work and the appreciation you already have, your other work being this, and see how we can leverage that Garrett Morgan program in a meaningful way to meet some of these K-12 challenges we have, including, and here's another thought that occurred to me when we were talking, when I think Glenn and others said, and you maybe too, Tom, we've got competencies well defined, but what do people want to hear about? What are the jobs out there?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a little bit of a disconnect. We got this set of competencies that will support this set of jobs, and you used the term yourself, when planning, most people fell into the jobs by accidentally because they didn't have an understanding of the pathway, back to what Stephanie talked about. So that's going to be a challenge in kind of implementing this and getting, even at the university level, how do we kind of reconcile this competency need and develop the competencies that might be across several occupations and skill sets, and at the same time speak to, well, this is why we're doing it. It's these jobs, and the jobs are out there based on your career. I've got a couple other comments, but I don't want to monopolize. I don't think monopolite's a word, is it? Thank you, Alex. Monopolize the conversation.
I'm curious, given the discussion we've just had, whether, in going back to Tony's original comment about the breadth of all of this, if Tony, you have any other thoughts about how to address some of these questions, like Ginny's questions about narrowing a focus, or at least highlighting some of the potential pathways that don't necessarily have to go to a four-year program, and how that connects to what I think you rightly identify as sort of the core competencies of our team, which is sort of university based. So I'd welcome any further thoughts you have on that.
Well, like I said when I made my comments, all of these professions and skill sets are important to the transportation industry. I mean, the work we have with the highway construction workforce pilot with the Department of Labor speaks to the importance of the construction trades in the highway industry and the transportation industry. And then a lot of the stuff that you talked about with engineering, safety, planning, are kind of at the, who designs and decides where the transportation projects are going to be built. How do you decide what safety countermeasures to put in place? Those are two very different worlds. And the way you approach those two sets of skills are very different. One is via the academic world, the other is through potentially with some of the community colleges, potentially at the K through 12 level, and then working with the highway construction firms that we're doing now with the highway construction workforce pilot. And when I look at the scale and scope of trying to do that, we just need to pick where we're going to be focusing our energies going forward. And if we simply identify that this needs to be dealt in this way, we set it off to the side, we're going to focus our energies on this pathway because this is what we can actually affect a change in right now, given the resources we have, then that's a direction. So I'm not hard over one way or the other on which of those two ways we go. But trying to encompass all of this in the work that you guys are doing seems like you've got an awful lot on your plate.
Yeah.
Tony, let me. I like that idea of focus, and I know that's important. And workforce is a big area, and it's a big challenge, and all these jobs and all that we talked about. So how do we focus? When I was listening to Teresa's presentation, I was kind of struck that she talked about bottoms up. Not the way you may think about it, Tom. I'm talking about from the occupation in the industry. Okay, I'll get back on course here. Anyway, and a lot of those jobs were in the maintenance construction area. And when I think about that, and also right up into a professional engineer. And then based on our conversation here, it's kind of crystallized my thinking a bit. And also to Tony's point, the tremendous need we have in the highway construction industry, we certainly have that very clear to us through the pilot program that he mentioned, and we're very engaged with. But anyway, and to me, those kind of jobs and occupations kind of fall into these three categories. One, the jobs that you may not need a technical career, a 2-year technical or community college or technical training so much, but you do need some skill training. Heavy equipment operators, welders, there are processes for that, for apprenticeships and pre-apprenticeship. The second group is the one that Teresa is spending some time in that area, and rightfully so, and that is this notion of supervisors of some jobs on her list there that lend themselves to technical schools and 2-year colleges. You need some additional training beyond this kind of basic, I can do 6 weeks and learn how to operate heavy equipment. You get better with time, but kind of that and she mentioned the Front Range. That Front Range program at Community College in Denver was driven by the Colorado, it's being just driven by the Colorado DOT. So, but then the third group is the professional engineers and engineering. And Teresa's an engineering professor, in addition to her other responsibilities at Wisconsin. And I know, and I think I appreciate, because I learned from her, that there's a lot going on in that area. And universities are trying to adjust to multidiscipline in the engineering field and some of the things we talked about. So what I'm really getting at is maybe going forward, the focus for Teresa could be that mid-range, because there's activity at the four-year schools in the engineering, civil engineering. Yeah, they can do more transportation. We appreciate that. But to Tony's point, where can we have the greatest impact? And we don't want to be in the position, even though there's need there, but there's other activity and that kind of basic skill, heavy equipment operator, welder, that kind of thing. But in this kind of management, more technical school training at the 2-year or 1-year level, where you do need to make an investment in skills, that might be the focus going forward. Because there's, as Tony says, there's a gap in all this stuff. So where we have the greatest impact. Yeah. But one last comment: when I listen to Stephanie, who also has that challenge because operations is broadly defined, I think about two things to try to conceptually kind of focus this more sharply. This activity. One, where can, and clearly by where can we have the greatest impact? But I use commercial drivers as an example. Tremendous need there. We know that. A skill that you can go through a 6-8 week truck driver training school, but get it. Okay. And the other thing is there's a tremendous need. It doesn't lend itself, CDL, to this more pronounced complex skill development. And the other thing is there are a lot of people interested and working on that. And the other last comment on that is that's a job that is a tough livelihood. Some people love it, but I won't go through all that. And so that's why I think there's such a need there. You're kind of pushing that boulder up the hill. You can get the training, but you're away from your families, and all that. So I guess I'm thinking if we can kind of look at this as obviously where we have the greatest impact, but who else is working in the space, and what the need is, and does it fit within our technical school 2-year or even 4-year program? So I just take CDL right off the map.
Well, so a couple things. One is I wanted to at least comment on the fact that while this is a really vexing problem, in some ways we shouldn't consider it surprising, because this is where the research has taken us. If you start with BLS data, which is what we had to do from a sound methodological perspective, you're going to find that truck drivers come up first. So I think you do have to start big. So my point being is we're at the point where we can be narrowing the focus. So, and we can saying, yeah, the research has taken us there. And the other thing, though, to your point about the truck drivers is I'm not entirely certain, though, that because of the impacts of technology, that if we throw something like that aside, we're not missing some of the future potential pathways. And now, I know, for example, that commercial driver's license trainees in some community colleges can now get certifications in supply chain because of the requirements now with the new electronic dispatch log, the EDL that's being implemented, the need for certain drivers who are driving alternative fuel vehicles. There's a higher order in terms of maintenance and repair that's connected to it. So I don't know that's where we want to focus, but what I'm saying is that there might be new pathways developed that are enhanced by the technology that's being used in the transport system. So I don't know where we go with that. I'm just throwing that out there. It's one thing that we found.
Can I make this brief comment? Stephanie, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that so while we're certainly not planning our implementation plans to focus on the CDL, I wanted to mention that exactly Tom's point right then about the fact that with the changing technologies, you're looking at a totally different skill set, and you're also looking at now you have pathways into other opportunities. And I think there's a lot to be learned from what's happening in freight that can be translated then over to transit and traffic. And I think that the other thing that is really important about CDL is that our discipline working group across the board, including traffic, mentioned that this was a skill set that needed to be recognized as a priority no matter which of these we were really talking about. And so even though the CDL driver occupation per se didn't make it onto the priorities in traffic, the traffic group talked a lot about the fact that that skill set is actually needed in some of the other priority occupations within traffic. So it really was a cross-cutting issue, and that's why it landed there, you know, beyond the fact that there were obviously the numbers to support it, but then also the fact that it's evolving so much right now that we're really looking at this changing skill set.
Stephanie, just one follow-up comment, and I've felt for a long time, you all got a challenging work here, but in your area, when you talk about operations, just to that CDL point, that then is partially, and a big part of that, operations, at least I think is the way we're talking about to some extent here, is transportation, distribution, and logistics. And that brings in CDL, warehousing, and there's tremendous need there and tremendous automation and pathway there. And if we step back and say, what's the need in the workforce, there's a need for that TDL, and that's where a lot of community colleges operate. In fact, most of them, I'm sure you all have seen this, in community colleges and maybe less so in technical schools, but that's where they spend their time in transportation is distribution logistics, because it's across the country. But the other thing that struck me was, and to your point about technology and cutting edge, and I refine my comment a little bit, maybe in my opinion, not the CDL driver, unless there's a pathway to fill some of that TDL management and supervisory logistics jobs, fine. But in the intelligent transportation area and the centers, I know you clearly you all we've having discussions with the ITS group with professional capacity building, and there'll be some work there. But anyway, is that commercial drivers, and you've even heard it now, or commercial operations, that's going to be the sharp focus for autonomous vehicles. That's going to be the first, or maybe not the first, I don't know if it'll be the first, but it may be the most broad-based autonomous vehicle operation, because it's very well defined. I had that experience in CDL. You can define that industry much easier, and you can relate to it and get with the partners and so on much easier than you can the broader transportation industry, because it's a more of a closed system. So that kind of cutting edge technology, and then if you take it one step further, what happens to all those CDL drivers that, if that happens in our lifetime, we'll see, and or autonomous vehicles, now where you have a shortage, we may have a surplus because they're all out of a job because it's the driverless vehicle.
No, that's clear.
Those are, these are broader questions. So yeah, just to your point, Stephanie, I don't know that I want to discount CDL per se, but not so much the 8-week training. What are the other, because people are working in that space, is my point.
Right.
So thanks for listening to that.
Yeah, as we go forward, one of the things too, you've heard a lot from Federal Highway, Tony and Clark and I. One of the things I like to do is hear something from each of you. In this partnership, this is a partnership, and what can we do as we go forward as an agency to meet some of the objectives, or perhaps open up new goals and foundations to go forward? How can we grow this relationship?
I'm going to turn to the team first.
Okay.
Anyone want to start? You all heard the question, right? How can we move forward with the partnership? How can FHWA be of service in that effort?
I know I've only been with you guys for a year and a half, but I know there are no bashful professors on this phone. So.
I want to start. Glenn, can I put you on the spot? You have any comments or thoughts?
Yeah, as soon as I find the mute button here, or unmute. Hi, Ginny. I think, and this is something we discussed in January as well, right along, and that's really, I think part of defining the partnership is having a long-term vision. what are we doing? We're kind of in, a more transactional mode right now, and how do we kind of move that so we can see the building blocks and how the work is going to be transformational as opposed to just transactional. So are we, just looking at kind of the current set of needs, which, there's some deep dive going on, particularly within highway construction, or are we trying to parallel that with activities which is really building for the future and trying to build an understanding of the change, really, and in the workforce needs and even the types of occupations that are going to be prevalent within what we will call transportation in 10 years and 20 years. And how should we be kind of working together to kind of hold those two things in parallel? So I think it's more, for me, and in some ways, the partnerships built on a common vision of what we're all trying to accomplish.
Thank you, Glenn. I appreciate that. And Steve, you do quite a bit of great work out there in the West. And one of the things is that you have the opportunity to work with our locals and a number of areas. We have a sister agency here, the LTAP, TTAP program, that also work with tribal governments and locals. One of the things that I would like to hear from you is, what do you see as an opportunity for Federal Highway to strengthen that program as well?
Opportunity with the TTAPs, and then we have an LTAP as part of WTI as well. And I'm familiar with the TTAP folks, in that I did write a proposal but did not win here, the recent one. I think there's a lot of opportunities, obviously, on the training side and on the safety side in terms of data collection and analysis and information. I think there's a great opportunity there. I'm unusually quiet today, and I'm not entirely sure why.
Neither are we, Steve, but appreciate the comment.
Yeah. One of the things I've just a couple of observations away from the partnership. I mean, maybe this is just for me, but when I saw everyone's presentations, I was like, wow. And also that there was a lot of overlapping stuff that we haven't had the opportunity to, I think, to kind of look at it and digest it and say, where could this be taking us? And given Tony's comments regarding maybe we're a bit broad here and we should be more narrowly defined, should we take kind of an observation of kind of reverse engineering what we might want to do, so that we have the end goal in mind? I mean, right now, I think we have great information, but what are we going to do with it other than having a demo? Is there a longer-term vision with a longer-term financial plan for doing this? And pretty soon, I think we may have something that we could shop around that then potentially could bring money to the table from private sector organizations that then maybe we ultimately add up, we end up having a kind of a three-legged stool between this effort, your office, and whoever other private sector organizations we could attract to this. Then we're leveraging money, but it's not all your money. And I've always felt that if you're going to have a partnership, just don't come to the meeting with your hands out. Come with some money. I'm sorry, I'm babbling.
No, Steve, I think you've made some really good points. I think if we're going to continue to evolve, we have to be able to sit back and say, hey, where are we headed? And are we on the right path? And one of the things that's necessary is that, and Tony, jump in if you choose to, is that as an organization, trying to think of us as a whole, and our partnership with the sister center is part of this process. Mm-hmm. And if there's something we're missing from this particular group, we need to be inclusive of that. And the fact that you're dealing with us on a day-to-day basis, Steve, we need to think about what are we not seeing. And you guys have heard me quote Eleanor Roosevelt a lot, but If I'm the smartest one in my circle is too small. So the point behind that is that as we go forward, we need to think about what are we missing. If we're not missing anything, that's great. But if we are, what does it need to look like? And are we taking advantage of all the opportunities in front of us for the programs that are right out there, especially in places like the western part of the country and the tribal governments and other places that are also our partners in this process.
And that may be the path toward narrowing the focus and creating a manageable set of outcomes, because we've tried to sort of keep on top of the highway construction initiative just so we see where they're all going. But if we look at the intersect between all your programs, you mentioned Garrett Morgan, and see if that narrows the set a little bit, that might be a useful step.
Let me make a quick comment here, and I think it speaks to your question about partnership with this center and with Federal Highway, Tom. We have seen a progression in Federal Highway from education grants, and some of you got grants back in Safety Lou, the region centers, which you all had the idea to form in NTW, been a tremendous resource. You're getting name recognition, branding, to now this center. And so now we have leadership capability in the Federal Highway Administration for workforce development. And we've never had that before. We've had it for the last 18 months. And we're learning. We brought the programs over from civil rights and so on. So here's my point, that going forward, I use Garrett Morgan again, an example. Personally, and we haven't vetted this out through our leadership here, I see Garrett Morgan as a coordinating function. I don't see how a single organization with the limitation they have on resource, and I know what that is going to be able to affect the public school system or the community-based organizations or whatever that activity is. I will be suggesting, and again, this is my view, this is not our policy here, that there's more of that kind of cooperation and engagement with the region centers, with Garrett Morgan more of a coordinating function. Mm-hmm. And we don't have to get, but anyway, so that's a connection point. Then when I think about an education continuum, and the next after K-12 is post-secondary, and that's what you all are working on. I mean, that's it for us, and we're supporting that. And we've already talked about, to Tony's point, and you all would all agree, we all would, you know, and your point made a good point, Tom. You spent the year getting your arms around this great big workforce piece. Now we're going to come up with a system, possibly more systematic a decision. This is how we're going to go forward and narrow that down where we can have the greatest impact. And then the last piece I think about is quote unquote professional development. And there are a lot of organizations out there, engineering, ITS, although there's some interest with ITS working in TW, that's fine. But for us, it's the highway construction workforce pilot. And we're talking, I have some very lengthy considerations, so we have great partnerships with our groups, and that's going to be, in my opinion, the focus for us in professional development. Now, would we like to work in the engineering area more specifically? Sure. But what ASCE does, as an example of a very prominent engineering, the prominent engineering organization in civil engineering, they're doing things in K-12. They're doing things in post-secondary, and they're doing things in professional development for their own engineering members. So we've got to start, I think that's what we're trying to do. Not go so wide because it's so broad, even to the points we talked about, getting sharper focus on these occupations, but to go deeper. Mm-hmm. Go deeper in K-12, go deeper in post-secondary with the program you have, but get that sharper focus, and you've done the research to feel more comfortable about that. And not us, in my opinion, we can't be all things to all people. We can't go out and work with ASC as much as the need is there, or the Metropolitan Planning Organization, much as the need is there. We're going to try to probably, through you all, not us, bite off, as you well know, a bit more for the ITS community because it's growing and there's a lot of opportunity there. So anyway, I didn't mean to maybe talk so long about that, but I see pretty clearly in my mind how the partnership can really get more solidified and more focused. We have our center, and we'll be talking, I think, about that from our perspective and sharing that with you as time goes on. Any other concluding comments or questions about the partnership or
think it's probably good we all take some time to digest
Yeah, I think so.
the report and the presentation, and this is good though, because
Well,
I think
this
it
is-
does.
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Teresa.
Teresa, yeah, can I just quickly just sort of brief Ginny and Clark and Tony a little bit? I know you've mentioned the construction pilot project a few times, and we've met with the folks from St. Louis a little bit to help give them some updates on that and sort of help to facilitate then with the regional group. And at the same time, we've chatted with them about what they're doing generally in terms of the urban strategy, where they're working with multiple large cities, particularly in the Midwest here, and recognizing that there's really a lot of groups of people that have been excluded from the unions, and it's making it a little difficult in some ways. And one of the things we've looked at is really apprenticeship programs, or we're getting ready to chat with them a little bit more on apprenticeship programs and the role of those with various construction companies that would help then kind of ground some of the workers. And we're looking at that with a model even with state agencies or the maintenance groups. It overlaps a lot of those skills, and where they're sort of with the same group of people working day to day and not with different crews in different construction settings. And so I just thought I'd throw that out. And in terms of the partnerships, and to make you aware that we're doing that, and that we're also talking with like the HR directors, the ASHTO at the meeting in Oklahoma City, talking to the HR directors about ideas of apprenticeship programs. And so that's kind of one of the directions we'd like to be going in the future, where we think we can focus on where we can make an impact and getting people the education and the skill sets that they need to advance careers within transportation agencies.
Thanks,
Okay.
Teresa.
And I think, you know, we're all going to be talking to you next week on the program plans, and there's definitely overlap in some of these areas, and maybe we should think about explicitly talking about what we learned from this discussion and how it connects to the program plans and future goals for the NNTW
Right.
once this 2-year grant is over.
Right. I think that's a great idea. And I look forward to, again, hearing from each of you and some of your ideas as to how we could go forward.
Now, for one idea, you know, when you look at transportation across our careers, and we're all around the same age, one of the things that's never been done is no one sells transportation as sexy. And if they don't do that, why the hell would you try to go work for an organization if it wasn't sexy or something like that? And should we be looking at not only doing smart workers, but almost smarter communities that now understand transportation and what's unique about it, that then they can sell to their children? I mean, it just seems like we've always missed the boat over the last 50 years probably of trying to sell transportation as a career, and that it's neat and that it's complex and it's bigger, that it really, you really understand, and there's a systems approach to managing all this.
I think all those are valuable points, and you're correct. I think you, the workshop that Stephanie will be leading next week will probably be addressing some of the ways that we need to be reaching out as an industry, as a university, helping our country and the people that are operating in this country to understand transportation and the value that comes with it. That's a huge topic, and it's about changing how people perceive something is real. But I agree with you, there is a need to better define who we are in transportation and the value that it brings. So yeah, let's talk about this. I think we have an opportunity to discuss it further.
Steve, we had sponsored for a few years the Fast Forward magazine, electronic magazine, I'm sure most of you are familiar with. Very good, 3 or 4 minute videos, good visually, easy distribution, send it out to a mail list, and so we just didn't have the money to keep it going. but that introduced middle school and high school students, at least in that kind of abbreviated way. But with an electronic medium, you could show projects, you could interview people, and maybe we can address that. But that's got to be part of a pathway. We've already talked about that. And when we step back, we are so, to your point, Steve, we are so fragmented. ASE has their high school education or engineering clubs. ASHTO has track. We have NSTI. There are construction career days. Up and down this skill set and education community continuum, we have programs. They're not connected. They're not strategic. So we have to give some thought. I think some of the tools are there. We just need to manage them better, coordinate better. And I think, frankly, in terms, this center, region centers, and industry partners. And they will be excited, and we just don't have the bandwidth to reach out and do all that. But we have some opportunities, maybe through Garrett Morey and the rest of the stuff I talked about, and what you all are doing. And you all remember right here in this room, 3 years ago, when we first introduced the region centers, we invited the partners in at TRB. They came in. Next year after that, we had a more focused discussion. So anyway, we've got opportunities here, and I personally see the region centers as an important outreach, not for workforce, not necessarily everything we want, but working with you to take advantage of your ideas and your experience, and then support that to have an overarching, more coordinated effect and impact on workforce development.
Yeah, and maybe just closing comment from me. I mean, I think one of the things that we do have is a willing and able set of partners nationally and at the regional level through the people who have taken partner discipline working groups and all of these other networks. And they always ask, tell us what you want us to do. So as we define a more narrow set of requests, I actually think it's going to be easier to implement some of that, because it'll be easier for them to understand what the outcomes are. So that's ready to go. That part is in place. So
Tom, we've got to be deep, not as wide, and we're getting there.
Yep.
And so thank you for this. I was really appreciate it. And I'll speak myself. Tony and Jenny can make their comments, and Alex, but not surprised, because I know the quality of work you've been doing, but very impressed with the thought process and the result to date. So thanks for that.
Tony, any other concluding comments from you before we wrap up?
No, other than to say thank you. I always appreciate having the conversation and listening to people's perspectives and viewpoints on things. And, you know, as we've already said, this gives us an awful lot to think about, particularly as we're trying to define where we want to go in the second year.
Agreed. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks
again for everything, and look forward to our discussion coming up soon.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your afternoon. I think we'll be touching base ourselves as a group and thinking about our own.
Any more today?
I think we have a 5 o'clock call, 5 o'clock East Coast time, a debrief. It's our director's call, unless I'm mistaken.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. Okay. Thanks to the team.